January 21st, 1945. 2100 hours. Kriegsmarine Headquarters, Berlin. Admiral Karl Dönitz stares at a map of East Prussia, watching red markers representing Soviet divisions close around the Baltic coast like a fist. 2 million German civilians trapped. The Red Army 40 miles from the ports. His staff waits for orders. Dönitz picks up the telephone and speaks 4 words that will trigger the largest sea evacuation in human history. Begin Operation Hannibal. Dunkirk saved 338,000 men in 9 days. The world remembers it as a miracle. Hannibal would evacuate more than 900,000 people in 15 weeks, most of them women and children, using a ragtag fleet of warships, cruise liners, fishing boats and coal barges, under constant Soviet air attack, through mine-infested waters, in the middle of winter, with the Baltic Sea freezing solid. Nobody remembers it. Because 30,000 of them drowned trying to escape, because the ships that carried them to safety were torpedoed, bombed and sunk. And because one night in particular, January 30th, 1945, produced the worst maritime disaster in human history. A tragedy so catastrophic that it killed more people than the Titanic, Lusitania and Bismarck combined. 9,400 people, dead in 40 minutes, most of them children. This is the story of Operation Hannibal, the evacuation that saved 5 times more lives than Dunkirk, and the night the Baltic Sea became a graveyard. The plan was simple. It had to be. There was no time for complexity. By January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Western Allies had liberated France and pushed into Germany from the west. But the real catastrophe was unfolding in the east. The Red Army had shattered German defensive lines across Poland and was driving toward Berlin with overwhelming force. In East Prussia, the isolated German province separated from the Reich by the Polish corridor, 2 million German civilians found themselves directly in the path of the Soviet advance. They had heard the stories. Refugees streaming west brought accounts of what happened when Soviet forces overran German towns. Rape, murder, revenge for 4 years of Wehrmacht atrocities in Russia. Whether propaganda or reality, the terror was absolute. Entire populations fled toward the Baltic coast. The only escape route left. 3 ports remained operational: Pillau, Danzig and Gotenhafen. Small cities never designed to handle mass evacuations. The roads leading to them clogged with refugees. Families pushing handcarts loaded with possessions through snow and sub-zero temperatures. The elderly collapsing from exhaustion. Children freezing to death in their mothers' arms. Those who reached the ports found chaos. Tens of thousands crammed onto docks, desperate for any ship heading west. Admiral Dönitz commanded the Kriegsmarine, what remained of Germany's navy after 6 years of war. Most of his surface fleet had been destroyed or trapped in port. His U-boats were being hunted to extinction in the Atlantic, but he still had ships, not warships, requisitioned civilian vessels, pre-war cruise liners, coastal freighters, training ships, anything that could float and move. On January 21st, he issued the order. Every available ship would proceed to East Prussian ports and begin evacuating civilians. Military personnel would be transported only if space remained after civilians were loaded. The operation had no official name initially. Staff officers labelled it Hannibal after the Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps against impossible odds. The comparison was apt. What Dönitz was attempting had never been tried at this scale. The first ships arrived at Pillau on January 23rd. The scenes were apocalyptic. Desperate crowds stormed the gangways. Mothers threw infants onto decks, begging sailors to save them. Elderly refugees trampled in the crush. Ships designed for 500 passengers loaded 5,000. No food, no water, no heat in the cargo holds where refugees huddled against the cold. But the ships sailed, and they made it to German-controlled ports in the west. Kiel, Flensburg, Copenhagen. The survivors disembarked. The ships turned around and went back for more. Within 1 week, Hannibal had evacuated 75,000 people. The operation was working, barely. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been beautiful once. Built in 1937 as a cruise liner for the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, she represented the Third Reich's vision of workers' paradise. 5 decks, swimming pools, ballrooms, designed to carry German workers on state-subsidized vacations to Norway and the Mediterranean. She displaced 25,000 tons, stretched 694 feet from bow to stern, and could comfortably accommodate 1,880 passengers. She had never carried passengers in peacetime. War came before her first scheduled cruise. The Kriegsmarine requisitioned her as a hospital ship, then as a floating barracks for U-boat trainees. For 4 years she sat anchored in Gotenhafen harbour, painted grey, her elegant interiors converted to cramped berthing spaces. By January 1945 she was obsolete, outdated, a relic from a world that no longer existed. Then Hannibal began, and suddenly the Gustloff had purpose again. Captain Friedrich Petersen received orders on January 21st. Prepare the ship for evacuation duties. He protested immediately. The Gustloff had been stationary for years. Her engines had not run at full power since 1940. Her crew was inexperienced, mostly teenage naval cadets and injured veterans. She had no defensive armament except a few anti-aircraft guns. Sending her into waters patrolled by Soviet submarines was madness. The orders stood. Refugees were dying in the streets of Gotenhafen. The Gustloff would sail. Loading began on January 28th. The original plan called for boarding 1,800 passengers. But the crowds on the dock numbered tens of thousands. Women with infants, wounded soldiers evacuated from field hospitals, naval personnel from dissolved U-boat training programs. They pushed onto the gangways in waves. Ship's officers tried to maintain order, failed. Refugees climbed cargo nets, forced their way through crew access, hatches, flooded into every available space. By the evening of January 30th, the Gustloff carried 10,600 people. Some estimates placed the number higher. Exact counts were impossible. Refugees packed into swimming pools drained of water, huddled in empty fuel tanks, crammed into corridors where movement became impossible. Children separated from parents in the chaos. Elderly refugees crushed against bulkheads. The ship sat dangerously low in the water, overloaded by thousands of tons. But orders were orders. At 12:30 hours on January 30th, the Gustloff's engines fired. For the first time in 5 years, she was going to sea. The weather was brutal. Air temperature, minus 18 degrees Celsius. Sea temperature, 4 degrees above freezing. Wind gusting at 30 knots. Ice forming on the superstructure. The Gustloff steamed out of Gotenhafen harbour, accompanied by 2 small torpedo boats as escorts. Her course would take her west through the Baltic, staying close to the German-held coast, then north toward Kiel. Estimated travel time 36 hours. Most of the refugees had never been on a ship before. Seasickness swept through the overcrowded spaces within hours. No functioning toilets for 10,000 people, no medical facilities, no food beyond what refugees had carried aboard. The swimming pool, packed with refugees shoulder to shoulder, became unbearable. People fainted from lack of oxygen. Others vomited continuously. Children cried without stopping. On the bridge, Captain Petersen faced an impossible decision. Soviet submarines were known to patrol these waters. Standard procedure required travelling without lights, zigzagging to avoid torpedo attacks, maintaining radio silence. But German minesweepers were clearing a channel ahead of the Gustloff's route. If he didn't illuminate his ship, the minesweepers might mistake him for a Soviet vessel and attack. If he did illuminate, he would become a target for any submarine within. Visual range. At 1600 hours, he ordered the running lights turned on. The Gustloff became visible for miles across the dark Baltic Sea, a lit target moving at 15 knots through contested waters. 60 miles to the north, Soviet submarine S-13 was hunting. Captain Alexander Marinesko was 32 years old, Ukrainian, experienced, reckless, brilliant, alcoholic. The Soviet Navy had nearly court-martialed him twice for drunkenness and dereliction of duty. His superiors tolerated him because he was one of the best submarine commanders in the Baltic Fleet. S-13 was his third command. A medium-sized submarine, 4 torpedo tubes forward, 2 aft, crew of 50, diesel engines for surface travel, electric motors for submerged operations. Marinesko had been at sea for 2 weeks with nothing to show for it. No ships sunk, no targets engaged. His patrol area in the Baltic had been empty. Frustration ate at him. He needed a kill. His career depended on it. On the evening of January 30th, S-13 was running submerged off the coast when the sonar operator detected propeller noise. Multiple vessels, moving west. Marinesko brought the submarine to periscope depth and rotated the scope toward the sound. What he saw made him grip the handles tighter. A massive ship, brilliantly lit, every porthole glowing, running lights visible from stem to stern, escorted by 2 small vessels. The target was moving slowly, perhaps 15 knots, and steering a straight course. No evasive maneuvers, no attempt at concealment. Marinesko did not know what ship he was looking at, could not read the name on the hull from this distance, did not know she carried 10,000 civilians. All he knew was size. This was the largest target he had ever encountered. If he could sink her, it would be the greatest victory of his career. S-13 manoeuvred into attack position. Marinesko closed to within 1,500 meters, well within torpedo range. The target's course was steady, predictable. He had a perfect firing solution. At 21:04 hours he gave the order. Fire tubes 1, 2 and 3. 3 torpedoes launched from S-13's forward tubes. They ran at 44 knots toward the Gustloff. Travel time approximately 50 seconds. On the Gustloff's bridge, no one saw them coming. The first torpedo struck the bow at 21:08 hours. The explosion tore through the forward crew quarters, killing hundreds of off-duty sailors instantly. The second torpedo hit amidships, directly beneath the drained swimming pool packed with refugees. The blast obliterated everyone inside. The third torpedo struck the engine room, killing the engineering crew and cutting all electrical power to the ship. The Gustloff went dark. Emergency lighting failed. 10,000 people plunged into blackness. The ship began listing immediately. Water poured through the massive holes torn in her hull. Watertight doors had been left open to allow refugees to move between compartments. Now the flooding spread without obstruction. Panic was immediate and absolute. In the swimming pool, the explosion had killed perhaps 2,000 people outright. The survivors, trapped in darkness, crushed against each other as the ship tilted. No exits visible, no light to see. Just screaming and the sound of water rushing in. Below decks, refugees who had been sleeping woke to find water already waist deep. Corridors became rivers. People fought towards stairways, found them blocked by debris or jammed with bodies. Parents lost children in the darkness. Families separated forever in seconds. On deck, the crew attempted to launch lifeboats. Most were frozen solid or covered in ice. Those that could be lowered were swamped immediately by refugees jumping from the tilting deck. Lifeboats designed for 60 people capsized under the weight of 200. The water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. Medical literature states that at this temperature, a human has approximately 15 minutes before loss of consciousness from hypothermia, 30 minutes before death. But those numbers assume calm conditions and proper clothing. Most refugees wore only night clothes. The water was not calm. Waves crashed over struggling swimmers. The cold was so intense that many simply stopped moving within minutes. The Gustloff was sinking fast. The bow dipped beneath the surface. The stern rose, propellers lifting out of the water. The ship's angle became so steep that people standing on deck slid helplessly toward the sea. Some jumped. Some clung to railings until the metal tore from their frozen hands. Others went down with the ship, trapped below decks, drowning in darkness. At 21:18 hours, 40 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff slipped beneath the Baltic Sea. She took 9,400 people with her. The exact number will never be known. No passenger manifest existed. No accurate count of refugees who had forced their way aboard. Some estimates place the death toll above 10,000. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history. The Titanic killed 1,500, the Lusitania 1,200, the Bismarck 2,000. The Gustloff killed more than all of them combined in a single night. The torpedo boats escorting her managed to rescue 1,200 survivors from the freezing water. That was all. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff should have stopped Operation Hannibal. It did not. The news reached Admiral Dönitz on January 31st. He read the casualty estimates, absorbed the scale of the disaster, then ordered the evacuation to continue. There was no choice. Millions remained trapped in East Prussia. The Red Army was closing the ports. Every day of delay meant thousands more civilians overrun by Soviet forces. The other ships kept sailing. On February 10th, 1945, the General von Steuben, another converted passenger liner, was torpedoed by the same submarine that had sunk the Gustloff. S-13 under Captain Marinesko struck again. The Steuben carried 3,600 wounded soldiers and refugees. She sank in 7 minutes. Only 300 survived. Similarly, the Goya, a freighter converted to refugee transport, was hit by 2 torpedoes from Soviet submarine L-3. She carried 7,000 people. The ship sank in 4 minutes. 165 survived. On April 16th, as Soviet forces closed on the last operational port, the Goya was struck again. This time carrying refugees from Hela Peninsula. Estimates suggest 6,000 died. Fewer than 200 survived. The mathematics were horrific, but they revealed something crucial. For every ship that sank, dozens made it through. For every refugee who drowned, 30 reached safety. Operation Hannibal was succeeding despite catastrophic losses. The logistics were staggering. Over 15 weeks, the Kriegsmarine and civilian vessels made countless trips into Soviet-controlled waters. Ships sailed without escorts, without air cover, through minefields and submarine patrols. Captains navigated by dead reckoning when instruments failed. Engineers kept damaged engines running through willpower and improvisation. The variety of vessels involved defied belief. Pre-war luxury liners, coal barges, fishing trawlers, icebreakers, naval training ships. Anything capable of floating and moving was pressed into service. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, designed for naval combat, evacuated refugees on her final voyages. She carried 1,500 civilians on one trip, artillery shells and refugees sharing cargo holds. Shore operations were equally chaotic, ports under constant Soviet air attack, docks damaged by bombing, refugees arriving faster than ships could load them, military police attempting to maintain order while civilians stormed gangways, wounded soldiers carried aboard on stretchers, pregnant women giving birth in cargo holds, children travelling alone, separated from parents killed in the flight west. The crews deserve recognition. Merchant sailors who could have fled. Naval personnel who volunteered for suicidal runs into contested waters. Captains who overloaded ships to the point of capsizing because leaving people behind was unthinkable. Engine room crews who kept machinery running while water flooded compartments around them. By the time Soviet forces captured the last East Prussian ports in early May 1945, Operation Hannibal had evacuated between 800,000 and 1 million people. Exact numbers remain disputed. German naval records were destroyed. Many refugees were never officially counted. Some ships' manifests were lost when vessels sank. What is certain is the scale. More than Dunkirk. More than the evacuation of Singapore. More than any single humanitarian operation attempted during World War II. Conducted under the worst possible conditions by a navy that was already defeated, and then history forgot it. Why does nobody know about Operation Hannibal? The answer is complicated. Partly political, partly moral, partly simply the chaos of how wars end. Germany lost. The victors write history. Allied accounts of the war's final months focused on concentration camp liberations, the defeat of the Wehrmacht, the occupation of Berlin. German civilian suffering was not a priority for documentation. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi war crimes. Nobody prosecuted the sinking of refugee ships. The Soviet Union never acknowledged the submarine attacks. Captain Marinesko received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal in 1990, 45 years after sinking the Gustloff, for his actions against enemy military targets. The official Soviet position remained that the Gustloff was a legitimate military target because she carried naval personnel and had been armed. This is technically accurate but morally complex. The ship carried 10,000 people. most of them women and children. The Geneva Conventions were unclear on vessels simultaneously carrying civilians and military personnel. Germany had its own reasons for silence. Discussing Operation Hannibal meant acknowledging why 2 million civilians were fleeing east. It meant confronting what the Wehrmacht had done in occupied Soviet territories. It meant explaining why German propaganda had assured East Prussians they were safe, then abandoned them to Soviet revenge. Post-war German governments focused on rebuilding, reconciliation, integration into Western Europe. Dwelling on German victimhood complicated those narratives. The survivors themselves rarely spoke. Trauma does not encourage testimony. Those who escaped carried memories of family members drowned, frozen, crushed in panicked crowds. Children who survived alone, parents lost in the chaos. Women who endured unspeakable experiences during the flight west. These were not stories people wanted to relive. The ships that successfully evacuated refugees received no recognition. The captains earned no medals. The crews were forgotten. Many were tried for war crimes simply for having served in the Kriegsmarine, regardless of whether they had spent the war rescuing civilians or fighting. Dunkirk became legend because Britain needed heroic narratives in 1940. The evacuation demonstrated resolve, unity, sacrifice. It was memorialized in films, books, national memory. Operation Hannibal offered no such clean narrative. It was Germans fleeing consequences of a war Germany started. Civilians suffering for crimes committed in their name. Victims who were also, collectively, perpetrators. History struggles with moral complexity. Easier to forget, but the numbers remain. 900,000 people who would have died didn't. Because ordinary sailors made impossible decisions. Because captains sailed into minefields knowing they might not return. Because engineers kept broken machinery running long enough to reach port one more time. The civilians they saved scattered across post-war Germany. Refugees without homes, families without fathers, children without parents. They rebuilt lives in a destroyed country. Their descendants live throughout Germany today. Millions of them. Most have no idea their grandparents survived because of an operation nobody remembers. The wrecks remain. The Wilhelm Gustloff lies in 45 meters of water off the Polish coast. The exact location was kept secret for decades. Salvage divers located her in the 1950s. The Polish government declared her a war grave. No recovery operations permitted. No disturbance of remains. The ship sits upright on the seabed, slowly collapsing as metal corrodes. Occasionally, Polish fishing boats snag nets on the wreck, bring up fragments, bits of railing, pieces of hull, personal belongings. These items are supposed to be reported to authorities. Most are simply thrown back into the sea. In 2006, a documentary team received permission to film the wreck using remotely operated vehicles. The footage shows what remains. Massive holes torn in the hull from torpedo impacts, debris fields surrounding the ship, interior spaces collapsed. The swimming pool where thousands died is now just twisted metal and silt. The team did not attempt to enter the interior. Too dangerous. Too disrespectful. 9,400 people rest inside that hull. The water is their cemetery. The General von Steuben lies nearby. The Goya rests in 76 meters of water. These wrecks are not marked on most maritime charts. Not memorialized, not visited. The Baltic Sea keeps its secrets. On land, a few memorials exist. In Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, a small plaque marks where the Gustloff departed. In Germany, survivors erected monuments in several cities. These are modest, understated. Most Germans pass them without noticing. There is no museum dedicated to Operation Hannibal. No major film depicting the evacuation. No widely read histories in English. The story exists in German archives, in specialized historical journals, in the fading memories of the few remaining survivors. As of 2025, perhaps a few hundred people who lived through Operation Hannibal remain alive. They are in their 80s and 90s now. When they pass, the living memory of evacuation passes with them. What remains will be statistics, declassified documents, and wrecks rusting beneath the Baltic. But the mathematics endure. The mathematics tell the truth that memory forgets. Dunkirk evacuated 338,000 in 9 days. Operation Hannibal evacuated more than 900,000 in 15 weeks. One is remembered as the miracle of deliverance. The other is barely a footnote. History is not written by those who survive. It is written by those who win. The sailors who kept sailing despite losses that should have stopped the operation. The captains who overloaded ships because leaving people meant condemning them. The refugees who survived freezing water, bombing, starvation, and trauma. They deserve more than silence. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps us share forgotten history with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe for more untold accounts from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Our community includes veterans, historians, and anyone who believes these stories